All right. Hopefully been seated now. So again, just welcome to today's webinar. Excited about this webinar focusing on the new TSA Pipeline Security Directive. Again, name's Mike Hoffman, Principal Industrial Consultant here with Dragos. Just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things though before we get started with the webinar. So this session is being recorded, and a recording will be going out to those attendees after the webinar. Also, we have muted the lines, but we still encourage you to interact with us. So you can interact with us via chat. One thing, so as webinar is going along, please feel free to use the chat to submit questions as we go. After the webinar, we'll have some time for Q&A. We have also, just so you're aware, we've also disabled the Q&A capability though, just to allow a little bit more privacy for the attendees. So the chat sessions just go to the speakers and moderators, and we will be working with those going along. With that said, we want to do a quick introduction and for the folks that are on the, that are working on the panelists today. So first of all, we have Jim Gilson. Jim is a technical leader of global services team. Jim focuses on, doing assessments in OT and that kind of thing. Jim has been involved in multiple large-scale initiatives, including developing, national cybersecurity standards, doing maturity evaluations across large corporations and so forth, doing architectures assessments, and also very, very involved in different standards and regulations bodies. Sam Wilson also is with us. Sam is the product marketing manager here with Dragos over at the Dragos platform. Sam loves working with customers, being able to solve some of the toughest challenges with cybersecurity regarding the platform and its capabilities, improving asset visibility, threat detection, and vulnerability management. With that, let's go to the next slide. So before we get started here, just want to do a quick overview of Dragos. I know most of you, if you've come to this webinar today, have come through the channels of Dragos somehow. So I'm sure there is some familiarity there. But nevertheless, want to kind of go through and talk about the different pillars of Dragos. So Dragos is a technology company built up around different capabilities. The first one around, of course, is within that community focus, safeguarding civilization, with a lot of our programs and those kind of things out in the community, such as different things. We have our intelligence arm with Dragos doing looking out that forward looking out in the threat actors, those kind of the people that are targeting these infrastructures. Also with our services teams from consultancy and penetration testing, risk management, and so forth. All of those different pillars, if you will, they'll feed back into our technology stack, our Dragos platform, and those kind of things, looking into being able to detect through, looking at network protocols and so forth, looking at behaviors, understanding your asset inventories, getting that visibility, understanding traffic flows and so forth. So Dragos, again, it's made up of multiple different facets, all of those things here to serve and support the community. And one of the ways we do that is through this, looking out within changes that are going on in the community, such as this TSA directive that we're talking about today. With that, I'll hand it over to Jim and let him kind of walk us through some of the things that are going on here. With that, though, before I do that, just the agenda today, though, is really the timeline of events, thinking about what's going on with the standard, the TSA standard. So we have, with the standard has kind of matured quite rapidly through the 2 series. We went from B to C. So here today, we're talking about, with the events of this kind of leading up to this new standard or this new document that's come out. And also looking at ways too that the Dragos platform and other parts and pieces of Dragos can support the community through this effort. So I know these require a lot of effort, a lot of time commitment from folks, and we're here absolutely to help and support your needs where they seem fit. So with that, we hand it off to Jim and we'll get started.
Thanks, Mike. So taking a look at the timeline of events, it really kind of stemmed from the Colonial Pipeline attack in May. So that was sort of a primary forcing function to TSA developing this series of pipeline security directives. So to start with, on May 27th of 2021, TSA released its first security directive for pipeline owners and operators. This was fairly benign. It was just a way for them to start saying, okay, we want you to start thinking about cybersecurity and have at least a minimum set of things that you're doing related to that. TSA had previously released a series of pipeline security guidelines back in 2018, and then they updated it in 2021. And so one of the, they basically were saying, okay, we understand that we've released this. We'd like you to start really looking into how you can work with that. So the first thing in the first series of pipeline directives was establishing this cybersecurity coordinator. So this was a single point of contact that TSA could go to understand the way that organization did cybersecurity, how they who they could contact in case they needed to find out what was going on. Maybe they had a cybersecurity incident. So TSA wanted this single point of contact to have at their disposal. And then they were also required to sort of report cybersecurity incidents to CISA within a certain amount of time. The recent version says within 24 hours. So basically, in case the organization does suffer from an incident of some sort, they needed to report that to the government agency, to TSA, so that they could start to plan for any long-term impacts or anything like that. And then related to that pipeline security guideline, TSA wanted the pipeline owners and operators to actually sort of conduct a vulnerability assessment of their systems against this security guideline. Previously, it had been somewhat voluntary. It wasn't like an actual regulation. It was, here's a series of things that we think owners and operators should do to improve their cybersecurity. And now they basically said, okay, we've had this out there for a while, you should know about it, and we would like to find out where your gaps are related to that security guideline. Then on July 20th of 2021, TSA released its second security directive. This one was much more prescriptive in nature, and it had a whole series of security critical mitigation measures is what they called it. But basically, these are cybersecurity controls that get applied to the system in order to improve the overall cybersecurity. When this document was originally released, it was considered security sensitive information. So one of the difficulties that pipeline owners and operators had was that they could request a copy of this document from TSA, but then they couldn't reshare it with their vendors or their suppliers or integrators in order to sort of add those requirements into their service agreements or their contracts. They couldn't point to it. They had to then go and recopy those in or determine how it would work in their environment. They couldn't share the document directly. On top of that, then the information resulting from that was also considered security sensitive information. The second point in the directive was this idea of developing contingency plans or incident response plans. As a direct result from Colonial Pipeline, they wanted to make sure that owners and operators had at least a plan for how to deal with a cybersecurity incident, understanding that no system is perfectly protected and there will be incidents. So they wanted to understand how the organization responded to those incidents. And then they also wanted to understand and make sure that the organization understood how to test the effectiveness of their cybersecurity practices. So not just putting things in as sort of a preventative measure, but then finding out how well they're actually doing with those cybersecurity measures and how well their plans match up to the desired level of cybersecurity protection. So TSA spent time over the next year evaluating not just owners and operators, but also evaluating and receiving feedback on those cybersecurity directives. In May of this year, May 29th of 2022, they released a revision to the first cybersecurity directive. This was mostly to reaffirm the original version. There weren't a lot of major changes. If I remember right, the May 20th, the one that was released in 2021 only had a year long before it had to be renewed. And so this version earlier this year was just a sort of mostly a renewal of that. Next, in early June, TSA listened to some of the suggestions they got from owners and operators and decided to remove the security sensitive information marking on the original version of the second directive. And what that meant is that now the owner operators could just attach that to a contract and say, you need to meet these cybersecurity requirements as part of our contractual agreement, instead of having to reword or rephrase those requirements, which made it a lot easier for the owners and operators to work with. And then on July 21st, so just about a month ago, TSA released a revision to the security directives, and that's what we're going to be kind of focusing on here within this webinar. And we'll get into the details of what's included in the document here shortly. Now, one of the things about the most recent revision to the second security pipeline directives is that it was a major shift in focus from what they released in July of 2021. The first major thing is that they changed from very prescriptive requirements to what are called sort of more functional or performance-based requirements. So instead of describing how and how soon very specific technical things had to be done, they switched to more functional and performance-based language to saying, okay, this is why, or this is what we would like you to accomplish, and this is why we would like you to accomplish it. And what that did is it allowed owners and operators to find the technical solutions and find and make those risk-based decisions of what they would actually implement at one particular time that met their particular needs. Another major focus and shift was sort of realigning the standards and requirements with ones that are more industrial control system or OT aligned standards. So there were less specific requirements that are sort of IT focused and understanding that there's a difference in the environment for OT, and so that was another shift as well. And then lastly, there was a sort of shift in the way that they discuss deadlines. The earlier version had sort of a requirement by requirement deadlines, and so some things were 30 days, some things were 15. You had to do this within 7 days. There was a lot of different specific deadlines and timelines that you had to deal with. And instead, the new version basically discusses an overall timeline for how the organization deals with things and looking at sort of implementing plans for how they're going to work with cybersecurity. So going along with the idea of those deadline changes, the sort of like the three main elements in the revised pipeline directives are this idea of a cybersecurity implementation plan, the Cybersecurity Assessment Plan, and an Incident Response Plan. These aren't really major differences between what was in the original plan and what's in the revision. It's just the way they phrased it, and as I said, some of the differences in timing on things. So the organization has to develop this implementation plan and turn a draft into TSA within 90 days of the effective date. So that is sometime around the 25th of October. Don't quote me on that date specifically, but that is from the effective date. That should be about 90 days out. That basically was a discussion of, here's the draft. And so at that point, TSA and the owner operator work on basically getting an approval for that draft. So it's not that they're being held to that the instant they turn in that draft. They're trying to actually make sure that that draft is sort of acceptable to TSA. And so there's an approval process that goes through. And then once that draft is sort of accepted and approved by TSA, within 60 days of that approval, they need to turn in a draft of their cybersecurity assessment plan. So that will be that they have to basically say, okay, how we're going to assess that we are implementing our cybersecurity practices and policies effectively, and then also build into that the ability to scan or measure that effectiveness on an annual basis. And then lastly is the incident response plan. The language around the incident response plan is somewhat vague in terms of deadlines on it. It just says it must be kept up to date. On top of all this, the security directive itself doesn't really talk much about potential penalties to not meeting these dates. That's something that TSA themselves would have to comment on directly. There's nothing written into the directive itself discussing penalties. So now delving a little bit deeper into the requirements themselves, the elements in the directives should seem fairly familiar to anyone that's looked at a cybersecurity standard, whether it's IT or OT. They all have very similar elements. And so the first one is identifying the critical cyber systems. This is a main step for just about every single cybersecurity standard out there, is understanding what you have in order to develop your protections. And from the regulation point of view, this also helps the owner operator sort of scope out what the particular, what is actually under regulation. So they can basically work to understand what are considered critical cyber systems. That's actually a very specific term in TSA speak. And so they can basically define that as part of their implementation plan. Next is network segmentation, understanding that there are differences in the networks that are involved with IT and OT systems, and understanding that that boundary that may exist between those two systems is very important. So to start with, they want to basically understand a lot of the interconnections between different systems within an environment. So a lot of times they're broken into different zones, and whether that zone is lower down in the architecture and more device focused, or it may be things like your demilitarized zone that are protecting your OT from your corporate network. They want to understand the dependencies that you have and the different connections that you have going across those zone boundaries. And then on top of just understanding the connections that are going on, understanding the security boundary protections that have been put in place. So understanding the firewall rules and understanding the access control lists or restrictions that have been placed to help sort of respond to and deal with the spread of an incident in case it happens. Next major section is access control, and they're looking to not just look at remote access into the system, they're also looking at local access. So how does someone that's an engineer on the system access things? What kind of protections are in place within the entire environment to sort of like restrict access controls throughout the entire environment? To start with, where feasible, they would like to have password resets, and that there are a number of devices that get left with default passwords, or they may be simple passwords, or passwords don't get changed when people leave. So they would like to basically schedule password resets where possible and where feasible within the environment. Again, this is sort of, they're not expecting it to be done within this number of days after enablement, but they basically are trying to say, okay, figure a schedule out that works for you to actually to conduct these password resets. On top of just password security, they would like to supplement that with multi-factor authentication where possible and where feasible. Again, they understand PLCs are probably not going to have MFA associated with it, but maybe the engineering workstation that controls that PLC or controls the program that's loaded onto that PLC does have the ability to run multi-factor if you're accessing it remotely. So they're trying to say, okay, supplement what you can do with regular passwords with an additional level of security as well. And then looking to sort of utilize least privilege. This is a standard practice that's discussed in a lot of different access control things. It's limiting the amount of access any one particular user has to just the things that they need. And going along with that is limiting shared accounts. So a shared account, you can't sort of uniquely identify individual people to limit their ability to have certain privileges. So limiting those number of shared accounts to the minimum is important. Not everything has that capability. Some of the older devices especially don't have the ability to create individual accounts. So they say to limit it, not get rid of it completely. And then one last aspect to access control is understanding that a lot of the environments within the OT world use Windows and Active Directory or other types of centralized user account management functionality. And you need to understand the relationships between the different domains that are set up within your environment, whether that's having an OT environment that relies on some trust relationship with IT or multiple domains within the OT environment or things like that. You need to understand at least what potentials those would lead to if there's a trust relationship between those zones. Another major aspect to the implementation plan is continuous monitoring and detection. And I know it's somewhat self-serving to have a product company that talks about, that builds a product in continuous monitoring and detection, telling you that, yes, you have to do this. But in reality, what it is it's an assumed breach model. No protections will be perfect. So there's always an assumption that someone can get in if they want to get in. So if they do get in, how do you know that they're in there? How do you know that your systems may potentially be affected? So you have to add on these additional monitoring and detection functionality into your system to understand that potential for an attack happening. So monitoring and potentially blocking suspicious or malicious code or communications. Maybe that's a download of a malicious program, or it may be Modbus traffic that's going across your OT boundary that shouldn't be there, or something like that. just understanding what should be there, getting that baseline of what your systems should be doing, and then understanding and being able to sort of like audit when they're not, when you see things that are outside of that norm. That doesn't mean that everything outside the norm is automatically bad, but what it does mean is that this is outside of what I'm expecting, so maybe I should go and investigate it. And it may turn out that it was just some emergency situation or an alert that doesn't normally happen, an event-based alert or something like that. But at least you have this understanding that something new happened and I should go and take a look at it. And then also having the ability to collect and analyze intrusion and anomalous behavior. So having some sort of monitoring system that sort of exists outside of the normal control system, whether that's passive network scanning or a passive network sort of monitoring of the system, or it's collecting logs that are sort of produced by the individual devices themselves. Having something that sort of like can look over all of the systems and identify potentially threat-based activity. And then going along with monitoring and detection, as well as that network segmentation piece in the previously, is the ability to sort of like isolate OT from the IT network in case there is an incident. And this is in direct response to Colonial Pipeline, where their IT systems were what was truly affected. It didn't extend into the OT environment. However, there were those dependencies between the OT environment and the IT environment, and they didn't understand fully how tightly those were integrated. So now this is making sure that you have the ability to fully isolate if you need to, and understanding the potential impacts of that. Maybe you can work at a degraded sort of performance level, but at least you can continue operating. It may not be, you may not have as nice output, or you may not be able to track things as down to like micrograms or something like that, but at least you could identify general amounts of things going through your pipelines as well. So the last area of the implementation plan really has to do with patch management. And this is an understanding that patching within the OT environment is quite a bit different than patching within the IT environment. You can't just reboot all these systems when things happen. They need to be up and running 24/7. And so you may need to wait for the next shutdown, or you may need to wait for the next maintenance window in order to install patches. So this is sort of that aspect of looking at your potential patches that are coming down the road, whether that's Microsoft or the particular PLC vendor or whatever, and being able to look at them and understand the criticality of that patch or update, and sort of categorizing and determining what is critical and has to be done with now, what may potentially have to be done later, and then what can actually be put off completely because it's more of a functionality or a feature update versus a security update. So things like that, and being able to sort of like look and identify the critical things that you need to do, and applying them where it is feasible, and then implementing, sort of establishing a timeline for how you can proceed with those set of patches. You're also trying to then, this idea of categorizing and determining criticality shouldn't be just based on your own internal experience. You should use information that exists from sources like the DHS CISA, for things like the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. They provide a lot of information specific to ICS vulnerabilities and patches and updates. So take a look at that to help prioritize and categorize those different patches and updates. And then where you know that you may not be able to implement those patches, or updates, figuring out a way to sort of develop alternative mitigations or compensating countermeasures when you can't apply them right away, or they may not be, that you may decide that the risk to applying those patches is too much at all, and so you have to figure out another mitigation strategy to deal with that potential vulnerability. Now, the next aspect is taking a look at that assessment plan. So this is mostly about assessing the effectiveness of the implementation plan itself. So a lot of what you're trying to do now is conduct, the first aspect is sort of conducting that architecture design review. So looking at your systems and understanding how they're designed, doing some network traffic reviews, doing some look at the system logs that you got, configurations, and understanding how it's designed and how you can sort of improve the overall cybersecurity as you're going along. And then looking to see how you can do more advanced testing. So a lot of times an architecture design review may be either somewhat of a paper study or passive within the system. But then how can you incorporate more advanced kind of testing and say penetration testing or red team or purple team testing within your environment as well, whether you do that in a lab environment, whether you do it during a maintenance window or something like that. So looking to say you should look into these testing because they're more in, they will get you a more realistic view of how your system actually reacts to the potential incidents. But understanding that there are aspects of that that shouldn't be done in a normal running environment. And then lastly, developing this incident response plan. This is very similar to a lot of other incident response plans, whether it's safety or production kind of things. But understanding that you're dealing with cybersecurity. So you're dealing with things that people may just not be used to. They may think it's more a production aspect, and so you need to actually do things like run tabletop exercises to understand how your people will go and actually respond to a particular incident. And some of the things that they specifically want you to call out and understand is run sort of scenarios of segregating infected networks. You know that you've got an incident in this particular facility or this particular system within a facility, and how do you isolate or how do you segment that network so that it doesn't spread around your systems? How can you isolate IT and OT, like we talked about before, in case there is an incident on one side or the other? So this isn't counting on IT always bringing things in. Maybe something comes into OT and you want to prevent it spreading out into IT or even into other facilities within your OT environment. Securing and maintaining backups. So this is always an aspect of trying to, how are you going to bring these systems back up and running when you do sort of restore operations? Having that way to bring your systems back up, that you know that your systems are backed up and can be restored. You know that the integrity of the backups is actually good. And that you're not trying to bring something back up with a corrupted backup. And then also trying to identify sort of the individual positions and people that are going to be responsible for actually implementing this incident response plan. So as part of the conducting these tabletop exercises, you're going to identify certain people that need to be responsible for certain aspects, and then writing that sort of aspect into their role descriptions so they know that they're actually responsible for this. It's not just they're being grabbed in case something happens. They actually know that they've got this responsibility. They're supposed to do these things. This is who I'm going to contact if I have to do something from here. So with that, I will hand it over to Sam, and I will stop sharing. And Sam's going to pick up to talk a little bit more about Dragos services and platform.
Great, thanks, Jim. So, I mean, as Jim mentioned, there's really nothing that's new or novel with Pipeline 2021-02C. Most of you are already doing these things. This might seem like it's a kind of a distraction. Maybe you're feeling you're already overwhelmed, you're under-resourced. How do we handle this new thing that's coming at us? And what we'd like to do as the last part of this webinar is kind of explain some of how what we have to offer could help you to fulfill the mandate and some of these different controls that have been specified. Jim and Mike and others, they're very humble colleagues that I have, but one of the things that I'm most impressed with working for Dragos is we've had people that have been involved in writing standards at a national level, serving as co-chairs on subcommittees, even protecting some of the super majors like the biggest oil and gas customers. And so what you'll see us sharing today is really informed by the experience of these folks that have joined the fight on our side, so to speak. All right, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but what I wanted to do is just to kind of start to align or to map some of the various components we have in things like our platform to Pipeline 2021-02C. And just to make it a bit easier to consume, and this is a partial list, we'd be happy to give you a full breakdown after the webinar. Make sure that you reach out to us to get that. But if you hear any vendor that's saying to you that they can help you to be completely compliant with this directive, I would question and challenge that. There's so many components to this that are only going to be met by a combination of automation and technology. But there's a huge piece that's really going to be formalizing different policies you might have, looking at compensating controls, how do you assess what's in your environment? And so it's not going to be, there's no magic solution out there. I mean, if you think back to solar winds, when it happened, on a podcast this morning, I was listening to Mandiant talking about that. And it was only because someone did a manual check on an MFA alert and they contacted the employee to confirm what was going on that the whole solar winds fiasco got uncovered. So just translate what you're hearing here in Pipeline 2021-02C back to what you're doing today, right? Keep doing those things and look at this as something that you will continue doing, not something new that you have to do. I know a lot of you on the call are either aligned with compliance or risk management. This is still a core part of your job. And this is just a way to kind of capture and formalize what you're already doing. So think of it that way. But if we talk specifically around how the Dragos platform can support different components in the security directive, there's a number where we have core capability that directly aligns, and then a number of different areas where we can provide supporting like data. For example, we have a lot of different third parties and partners that we integrate with, maybe on the firewall side or on the SIM side. And so we can be part of that ecosystem, and that combined with the services that Jim will explain before we're done here, help to paint a pretty holistic picture. But let's just drill in for a minute. There's a few specific use cases that I can illustrate easily. Some of these Jim covered on earlier slides. So if you think of how you're monitoring for connections between the enterprise or the IT and the OT networks, and then anything unexpected that's beaconing out to the internet or some external network, make sure you've got systems in place that can detect that network communication, but also if there's a threat, so there's a certain behavior, maybe there's some composite detections you want your vendors to be able to provide, and not just signatures, but actual intelligence based on types of attacks that they're seeing in the field with their customers. And then, of course, there's another big component that has to do with having a thorough assessment of all of the assets and devices that are in your environment. Not only that, but knowing which of those are vulnerable and which ones to pay, to give the first priority to. So once you know what's there, you have to know what to do with it. And the best way to know that is if you have a system that's able to give you the guidance and to prioritize where to spend your efforts first. So let's take a look at a couple of these. These are static screenshots of an oil and gas demo system we have that's running our platform. And this is just to give you an idea of what to expect. And again, if you're interested, reach out to sales afterwards. We'll have one of our solution architects get in touch and we can do a walkthrough of what this might look like for you. But being able to process tremendous amounts of data in almost real time is critical, especially for multi-site environments. So what you want to be able to do is to spot unexpected traffic between locations, sites, or subnets. There's ways in our platform that we can logically group these things. And we have a time bar facility that lets you scrub back and forth. So for doing forensics or any kind of incident response, being able to go back to a certain point in time and see right at that date and time which devices were communicating, what protocols were being used, the amount of information that's flowing back and forth is extremely effective for teams that are doing any kind of incident response or trying to troubleshoot or triage what's going on. And likewise, being able to group things logically. So, tagging or categorizing assets so that they're presented in a way that makes sense to operators, not just a big table of data and devices with names that are arbitrary, but seeing the logical function and grouping of these different collections of devices, and then the flow of information between those different components helps you to pinpoint the things that really are happening that shouldn't be or that may not be authorized. I mentioned knowing which devices are in your environment, and believe it or not, this is a challenge for a lot of customers, big or small. Just the nature of the industries that you're working in, sites that are highly distributed, acquisitions, divestitures, changes during turnover that don't get documented, things that are commissioned and may not be fully documented. It's a changing environment, but they're long-standing environments. And so we understand having visibility is sometimes a challenge. But that's the foundational part to then knowing which of those systems you've got visibility into are vulnerable. And what we've developed is a system in our platform that takes those public CVSS scores, and our threat intel teams are analyzing all of those, especially the ICS or the OT specific ones. And they're looking at them in the context of how those systems or those devices are typically deployed in the real world. And in a lot of cases, we'll either upgrade or downgrade those scores based on reality and not just what the vendor or CVE might be saying those scores should be. So we're looking at it to give it context based on reality, and then we adjust those scores. And then from that, we're able to assign a risk level, right? So you want to focus on the most critical vulnerabilities first. And we also indicate by measure of a confidence score how certain we are that what we're seeing is in fact that device, and this vulnerability does in fact pertain to that device. So these are different measures to organize the work you'd have to do. And then what we also provide customers for every vulnerability is a prioritized ranking list of now, next, or never. So now are the vulnerabilities that we think you should get on as soon as you can. Next would be the ones that come next in order, obviously, and never are ones that we feel probably don't have enough criticality that you need to consume resources to mitigate those. For all of the different vulnerabilities, we include a lot of detail. So we describe it. We have our own curated guidance. So beyond just improving the accuracy of the public scores, and you'll see this Dragos corrected CVSS score here as well. We give you the mitigating guidance around how to deal with that vulnerability. And then we're not only just doing vulnerability monitoring, which some vendors provide, but we're allowing you to manage those vulnerabilities over time. So you can accept it, you can assign it, you can track the disposition of that vulnerability so that you've got an audit record. And again, for a compliance perspective, it's really important that you can show an auditor, hey, we knew about this vulnerability. This is the action that this person took, and all this is being logged as well. So you've got that system of record to be able to go back to. In the summary of the vulnerabilities will include information like what ports we're seeing traffic going over, maybe how many different source IPs we're also sending communications, and then which of the products are affected, right? So it's important to know in your environment, again, so it's contextual. This is what we're seeing, and this is where to focus. Beyond that, we give even more granular levels of detail. So the attributes that go into the score, the impact, the access levels that's required. Jim touched on this in one of his earlier slides, because remember that it's not only people that have access levels, devices have access levels. If you've got shared service accounts, guess what? Those devices are operating within the context of the permissions that service account's been assigned. And so we look at the security impact of this to your systems, but beyond that, the operational impact as well, because not only are you trying to stay compliant, right, and you want to manage risk, you want to protect operations, because, I mean, as Colonial showed us clearly earlier this year or last year, downtime is lost revenue, and there's impact to brand and other issues that need to be considered. So we look at the operational impact as well. And then we know that a lot of your environments, you have multiple instances of different devices or assets. So if you've got one device at one of your sites, there's a good chance you'll have that same device elsewhere. We show you where else we've seen those devices sitting, so you can kind of do some batch work on them all at once, again, to make the process more impactful with minimal resources. And then, if there's multiple CVEs that are tied to the vulnerability or those devices, we'll give you that breakdown so you can see exactly what's going into those, the confidence levels and the scores and the now, next, never guidance that we provide. So Jim, I'm going to turn it back over to you, but could you just maybe talk for a few minutes around how some of our global services complement Pipeline 2021-02C as well? You might be on mute.
Yep, absolutely. So there's a lot of aspects here that, as Sam was saying, that technology can't solve everything within the O2C requirements. Just to start with, identifying the owner-operator critical cyber systems. While that is a standard aspect to almost every one of the cybersecurity standards, understanding how that applies to the OT environment, understanding how you can actually, what systems may have a real impact on your overall production or things like that, is an aspect that we call crown jewel analysis. So understanding, sort of doing that system engineering breakdown of where your system, of what your important systems are, and then what the important subsystems are within that, what the individual components are, and then maybe even the functions within those components. Taking a look at the sort of like incident response side, we talk about having incident response services. So we have incident response workshops where we can help you actually develop incident response plans, or at least come up with plans of how you can develop your own plan. We will help you sort of understand the aspects that need to get put into that. And then on top of that, there's an annual exercise to test the effectiveness. And so that's where we can also help you sort of like run tabletop exercises. And so we'll actually go through and help you understand who needs to be involved, what their potential roles are, and then actually develop scenarios that are relevant to your organization. Going along with the assessing the effectiveness, they ask for having this cybersecurity architecture design review. And so we have a special, or not a special, basically we have an aspect to our architectural design review that's specifically targeted at sort of pipeline cybersecurity and understanding this particular directive and understanding aspects that go into the need to conduct those reviews. and then getting on a schedule to conduct or help you develop a plan to conduct those every 2 years. And then also going along with that architecture design review piece is understanding how to do effectively assess all those aspects. So not just the implementation plan, but also your incident response plans and other aspects as well, to just develop that and have it sort of integrated into your whole system. And then, as I said before, they would like you to look into things like more in-depth, more invasive testing. And we have a network penetration testing and purple team testing that can help you to do that. And we've got experience of doing that within the OT environment and all the aspects that go along with that.
Great, thanks, Jim. And I know also that we have, for example, some folks on staff that are even former TSA auditors. So there's a lot of kind of in-house expertise around, practically speaking, what can the pipeline owners and operators expect moving forward? And we'll do our best to provide guidance to customers through that process if they're interested. Okay, a couple more slides, and then if there's any Q&A, let's save a few minutes at the end. But maybe, Mike, do you mind doing a quick wrap up, and then we'll see if there's any questions that were submitted?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so if you can kind of think about, this presentation so far, and thank you, Jim and Sam so much for doing, kind of going over those two key areas. But for you folks that are owners and operators, today, some of the takeaways and the deliverables are beginning to work on these plans. So first of all, that implementation plan that starts, the work should be getting now to do that, making sure that you have an incident response plan in place. And if you need to dust it off a little bit and update it, now is the time to do that, of course. Again, irrespective of a TSA guideline, every company that is working in the OT/IT space needs to have an updated incident response plan. So you understand, when things occur, how do you respond, who your teams are, you have communication pathways and so forth, call trees, all that needs to be within there. When do you call, who do you call, that named responsible party and so forth, all needs to be wrapped up and packaged in that incident response plan. Additionally, of course, that assessment plan, looking at, building that out and making sure that you're looking at, doing that, the architecture reviews, and looking at more advanced ways to assess your systems with, using activities such as pen test and so forth. So upcoming, you've got a couple of due dates looking at this, like the one in October for the assessment plan. After that's delivered to TSA, once they do have an approval, of course, there'll be the, it'll actually, the 60 days for approval. And then also looking into, if you need support through these areas, looking for, folks that have been doing this for a while. So, looking at, such as Dragos, we've been supporting customers on the last, the 2B directive, if you will, for a while, doing these assessments and architecture reviews, pen tests, and so forth, and eager to help you as well and support you through this journey. With that, now it's time for a Q&A again. If you do have some questions, throw them in the chat, and we will attempt to answer those. But there has been a couple questions come up so far that I think would be, kind of worth a quick discussion. So the first one was, how do you recommend we start implementing or creating this implementation plan? So TSA has given some things, some parameters. How do I go take those parameters from, it looks like a question from essentially from the requirements to putting it on a piece of paper? Maybe Jim, this is a good one for you to take.
Yeah. So one of the aspects of that is that they by aligning with a lot of the OT existing standards and things, there's a lot of guidance material on not just what you have to do, but how you can go about doing it. So there's a lot of technical reports. There's a lot of like rationale and supplemental guidance for a lot of the related requirements. I would start looking at those first. That's a lot of material that's sort of been collected over the years. Past that, have a partnership with organizations that you feel comfortable talking to, whether that may be somebody that has a back channel to a competitor, or maybe somebody that has a discussion between one region of a country to another region of a country, or to other countries, or things like that. Find those trusted partners. While I did say competitors of things, like a lot of times people like move around in the industry, so there's a lot of just sort of like willingness to share a lot of information that you can find by sort of like reaching out.
Awesome.
I was going to add some more to that too, Mike, if you don't mind. I'm sure a lot of the members on the call are part of like the oil and gas ISOC, for example. Those communities are a great place to bounce ideas off each other. There is something that we launched recently called OT Cert. It's a collection of free resources to help, especially the smaller customers, learn about these things and to have some discussion with us if there's some guiding conversations that would help them in that journey too.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Great add-in. The next question that popped in was, and I thought this was a good one. Are critical cyber systems just for OT, or could they also be on the IT side?
Oh, they could absolutely be on the IT side. And Colonial Pipeline's a very like good example of that. Their logistics system that that basically like understood what was in the actual pipeline at any one particular time was actually contained within their IT systems. And the reason, one of the main reasons why they disconnected the IT from the OT is that they lost that understanding of what was actually going in the pipeline. I mean, it takes time for oil or natural gas or whatever to flow through these pipelines. And so they have to understand where the breaks are going to happen, where they're shifting from one company, like one user of the pipeline to the next user. They have to understand that correct billing or the correct logistics that goes along with the things that are like whatever material is going in that pipeline. And so that connection between IT and OT was very important. And so they needed to understand that and know that that system within the IT environment had to be protected at the same level because it was so critical to OT operations. Awesome.
Another question that came up was around, and this may be the last question just due to time, but regarding patching, which system should we focus on first, for patching? Again, resources are constrained. So which systems do we focus on first, or what's the most important for us?
I would say anything that's actually providing sort of network boundary protections should be like your primary focus, like your first immediate focus is updating your firewalls, updating your switches that are doing like network boundary protection, updating servers and systems within the DMZ that are being used to actually provide those security boundaries. From there, working your way down through the system. So doing that identification of your critical cyber systems, as part of that, it shouldn't be just critical or not critical. Yes, that's important to understanding what your scoping of your requirements for your regulation, but doing some sort of like decomposition of your systems to understand how critical are they. And once you do that, then you can understand, okay, these systems over here are absolutely necessary to my operations or to life safety, and then understanding that you have to protect those and trying to protect that as much as possible first and kind of working through from that criticality level.
Okay. No, awesome. Yeah, great response. Well, I think that puts us pretty much at the top of the hour and probably concludes this webinar. So, but with that said, we're going to continue the conversation. So if you have further questions that they may not have had an opportunity to ask during this webinar, we have got our contact information up there for you. I do want to thank very much Jim and Sam for taking the time to put this together, and also the people behind the scenes. These webinars take a lot of effort from a small team of folks, and I just want to thank you for that. And then also the asset owners and operators. You folks out there that are day in, day out, moving product and doing those critical tasks to support our civilization. So with that, thank you very much. And we will go ahead and conclude this webinar, and hope you have a good day. Take care.
Thanks.